What is the worst book you've ever read? Yusuu Naito. 50 Shades of Grey. Poorly written, has no substance whatsoever besides the fact they can find new ways to describe genitalia. You all have never read anything self-published by an aspiring novelist who isn't very good. I mostly read non-fiction, where what's bad can be a little different than fiction. The worst was a certain James Stewart biography. It had so many errors and it was obvious the author hadn't actually watched some of the movies he was talking about, plus there was a lot of weird slut-shaming for certain actresses who were more sexual-free in the 30s and 40s. The Jakarta Pandemic. Stephen Concoli. It was pornography for middle-aged libertarian preppers. All about a global pandemic and how the hero prepper of the story is a hero who defends his home and bangs his hot wife all the time while fighting off looters before banging his hot wife some more. Did I mention he bangs his wife, who is very hot? Because he does. I was given a free copy of the first Dianetics book by L. Ron Hubbard by some Scientologists set up in a train station. I had heard of them. And even though I found their presentation and that e-meter testing kind of silly, I wasn't going to say no to a free book. I'm open to new ideas, no. I gave up before I finished the introduction. The writing was convoluted and pretentious, first off. But what got me was when he used overly big fancy words and complicated sentences to say that it was best to explain your ideas without overly fancy words and complicated sentences. It was so weirdly immediately hypocritical that I tossed the book aside. My dad tried reading it, and got further than I did, but he found it unpleasant to read as well and didn't finish the After series, which was originally a Harry Styles fanfiction which was later published and then made into multiple movies. Both the protagonists are horrible people and it's just one old toxic trope after the other. It'll make you pull your hair out. A total train wreck. Introduction to Multivariable Calculus. 12th edition. The Subtle Art of Not Giving a F***ck. And I paid airport retail for that, too. Gak. Not everyone should write. I hated The Notebook. A coworker brought in her copy and pushed it on me because she saw me reading poetry once. It was the shittiest contrived garbage I've ever read, and the last paragraph felt pretty goddamn gross. Nicholas Sparks can eat a quarter-mile of dick. I was on an airline flight once as a child and was seated away from my family. I was a bookworm, and the woman seated next to me took note and told me she was a children's author. She handed me a copy of her new book and was eager to hear my thoughts on it. That shit sucked. Of course I felt obligated to read a good amount of it and pretend I enjoyed it. It was a generic children's fantasy story with an obvious author insert character. I wonder where she is today, thinking face. The Boy in the Striped Pajamas. It basically about world's dumbest German kid. He talks like a baby from Rugrats even though he is 9. Like he calls the Führer the furry in Auschwitz he calls out with. And that's so stupid cause that only makes sense if you speak English, which this little German boy doesn't. This kid has met Hitler but doesn't understand who he is. His father runs a concentration camp and the boy doesn't know what's happening. This German boy repeatedly sneaks up to the camp to talk to another kid in the camp, and this stupid kid still doesn't figure out what the camp is. Just treats the Holocaust with this weird levity that feels really inappropriate. Also, the author regular beefs with Holocaust museums who call out all the inaccuracies in the book. I absolutely cannot believe that some children actually read this for school, especially when there is a plethora of Holocaust books, many of them written by actual survivors. The IKEA book on how to put my dresser together. Jaws is awful. Beyond awful, and the movie is so good I don't know how the two are related. The books about sex, relationships, and marriage written by evangelical Christian authors. There are certainly good books about sex and marriage from a Christian perspective, but the majority of them are just awful. The shit they teach is delusional, harmful, and most often based on stereotypes. The Butcher and the Wren by Lane Urquhart. It was poorly written, like a half-assed essay written by a high schooler. The Scarlet Letter. It's one long, Boring run-on sentence toss-up between Twilight and The Cursed Child. 50 Shades of Grey. Never got the hype. It was pretty poorly written and the author used the same phrases over and over again. Verity by Colleen Hoover. Anything by Colleen Hoover has been removed from my to-read lists because of the utter shit Verity was. My Immortal is book length. Screeching teenager Harry Potter fiction. Ready Player 2. The Book of Mormon. I grew up being taught that it was God's inspired word and read a chapter every night out of obligation. I used to think I hated reading because I had to force myself to read it. I wondered how the inspired word of God could be so mind-numbingly boring. Plus I had to reread most verses 2 or 3 times to make sense of them because they're so grammatically poorly written, filled with run-on sentences, contradictions and incomplete thoughts. 010. Ready Player 2 was absolute dog shit. I was actually a big fan of the first book and was excited to see these characters, now older, on a new adventure. Instead what we got was a meandering mess that goes nowhere and is just an excuse for the characters to do more of the same but worse from the last book. Also it retcons one of the side characters into being a manipulative sociopath when he was just a misunderstood fool in the first book. Wicked. The one that inspired the musical Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Nope. Twilight. Lords Above, is that book rubbish? My GF at the time talked me into giving it a shot. It was poorly penned, creepiest romance since Lolita, and invoked no emotional response with its complete lack of character development. We were liars. I could literally go on for hours about this book, but to say this as concisely as possible. Insufferable main character, pretentious and inconsistent writing style, next to no plot, and twist ending that can be seen from a mile away. Also it's sold as a psychological thriller, but it's definitely a romance novel that thinks it's cool and you can't convince me otherwise. Scarlet Letter. A miserable time in American lit in HSO, *, The Celestine Prophecy. *, it spent so long on the NYT bestseller list that I figured it had to be worth a try. It was supposed to be some kind of fictionalized New Age spiritual journey story that gave the reader insight and expanded consciousness or something. Not only was it not insightful, nor did it expand my consciousness, it wasn't spiritual, it wasn't a journey, and it was barely a story. It had the vocabulary and writing skill and style of a very precocious 13-year-old. And it had the insipid, life-altering revelations of someone who has done acid for the first time and then made their whole personality about that without doing any introspection. It wasn't challenging intellectually or spiritually, and it made me so embarrassed for the author that he probably thought he was being deep and wise. Then again, he's probably a long-retired multimillionaire on the back of that meaningless tripe that he's sold to millions as a way of life, so joke's on me. I reckon I don't remember the title of the worst book I ever read, but I had heard so much praise about Atlas Shrugged that when I found a cheap copy of it at Goodwill I bought and read it. Or forced myself to read about 50 pages of it, waiting for the good part to kick in. I found it boring, and I threw it in the trash. I usually don't throw books away, but other than the one I can't remember the title for, it's one of 3 books I ever threw in the trash, instead of donating, because I didn't think it was fair to make someone else suffer through it. The Left Behind series. My mom had them in her bookcase, so I read them when I was at home caring for her when she was ill. They start off okay, then descend into preachy, padded snorefest. Whole chapters about tangential characters I couldn't gaff about. They actually managed to make the return of Jesus boring. Having read the Screwtape Letters, it was clear just how inferior a work of Christian apologetics it was. Utter trash. Ethan Frome and his stupid boring pickle dish. The Da Vinci Code. I mean, I ate it up, but the whole time I was thinking this is the worst written book ever. I'm not sure any non-English speaker will recognize it. It's called Juventud Onyxtasis. Growing up in 90s Mexico, it was a mandatory read where I went to school, and many other schools, whatever you call the year when students are 13 or 14 years old. It's basically a book trying to indoctrinate kids, trying to scare us from trying alcohol, sex, drugs, etc. There's a sequel to it. Forgot the name of it, but it goes deeper into the sex is scary thing, pregnancy, and abortion. Hilariously bad, pretty much propaganda. The Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown. The writing is laughable. Probably the absolute worst were my 11th grade history, aka political propaganda, conspiracy theories, and blatant lies textbook. Thanks, Abika. And the absolutely horrid religion textbooks I had to read at Liberty University online. It felt like drinking swamp water, and the leaps of logic, or rather lack thereof, make one wonder how the authors even managed to dress themselves. Go Set the Watchman. Odd that my favorite book and least favorite book are by the same author. Wuthering Heights. Ugh, hands down it has to be Wuthering Heights. It took me 3 tries, and I hated every minute. I will never understand why it's such a great love story. Heathcliff and Cathy were absolutely toxic, and there wasn't anything redeeming about them or their love-hate. Ready Player One was not good. Honorable mention goes to The Rainbow Fish. Anything by Colleen Hoover. I will never understand the hype around her books. I felt like I was back reading fanfiction about One Direction when I tried to read Verity. Couldn't get through the first chapter. The Bible. Lot of spoilers beforehand and stories are all very short. The author clearly can't decide if it's supposed to be sci-fi or fantasy or drama. But the explicit content is well written. I have read a lot of books. Mostly good, some bad. I powered through the bad ones. Catch-22 was one that for whatever reason I just never could finish. Atlas Shrugged. The Witch of Portobello by Paulo Coelho. I hate it and I hate the main character. Great Expectations. The only book I've ever hated. My sister bought me Nicole Richie's book, The Truth About Diamonds. I guess my incredulous statement of, "Who would buy this book?" was interpreted as, "Who will buy this book for me?" I read the first few pages of a clearly ghost-written book. It was meant to be fiction but also loosely based on her life. It was terrible. Of course, it was worse than some of the YA novels I have read. I'm not sure who it was aimed at, but it was so vacuous and referenced so many things that dated really badly. Just cringe. I'm sure Nicole didn't read it herself. My sister also bought me hubcaps that Christmas. The worst Christmas gifts ever. I have never forgotten. Earth's Last Citadel. A pulp novella from the 1940s, early 1940s, about an American spy who is sent forward in time with 2 Nazis, one of whom is apparently a hot Irish woman and a Scottish scientist, and ends up destroying the god figure of the desiccated and helpless future mankind while being hunted by a smoke-based alien who is allergic to sound. It's like if someone read both A Princess of Mars and The Time Machine and went, "Ooh, that, but shittier." It was only 130 pages and I had to force myself to finish it out of spite. Ready Player 2 starts out okay with some interesting concepts that are never fleshed out, but just gets worse and worse with every page, and monotonous pop culture reference. Not to mention the likable Wade is reduced to being nothing more than an Elon Musk edgelord wannabe. He's as low a super genius with perfect memory recall. Also, despite spending his entire life in the Oasis, he managed to watch every movie, listen to every album and B-side, and read every popular book from the 80s. It generates audible laughter by the third act from just how preposterous it all is. There are 0 side character stories and they serve no purpose until the story needs them to open a door or solve a riddle. Such a waste of time. Paper Towns by John Green. The stupidest, most meaningless, most pretentious book. The Godfather. Movie was excellent. Book was like it was written by A. Sentient Foot. Mockingjay. It's infuriatingly terrible. Being part of a trilogy that started off good, then was, fine, to being just awful in almost every way. I was assigned the book a separate piece to read over the summer, and I hated it. I'm not really sure what it was, but I didn't like reading it at all. The plot was creepy and somewhat unreasonable, in a way. The main character literally pushes his best friend off of a tree branch and into sharp rocks for almost no reason. The Midnight Library. The word schlock gets thrown around a lot these days, but holy hell, that book is awful. It's entirely based around how awful life can be, realizing that your life is a waste of time, and the whole finale is essentially, sometimes suicide is a good idea. People completely missing the point of Wuthering Heights. I don't read terrible books. I have no qualms about putting them down and never picking them up again. Mein Kampf. Burst out laughing multiple times in class because of the absolutely horrendous grammar, even for a translation. Most sentences were incoherent jumbles that sounded like something out of a 2-year-old. 50 Shades of Grey. Only read it so I'd be able to reasonably give an opinion on it, despite knowing well ahead of time how shite it would be. It was even worse than I'd imagined. Felt my brain cells melting one by one with each and every hideously formed paragraph. The Pact Asterisk by Jodi Picoult. I'm apparently supposed to feel bad for the male protagonist, but all I see in him's just greater than a rotten guy who doesn't understand what no means. Less than Gravity's Rainbow. I think it is the only book I ever started and just gave up on. I know it won a lot of awards and is considered a masterpiece by some, but I just could not get into it. The Subtle Art of Not Giving a F***. It's just bro code Buddhism stuff.